There's a sentence she's already said to you, maybe this week, maybe today. And you let it pass like it was nothing. It sounded fairly small. It sounded like tiredness, or a bad day, or nothing at all. But somewhere underneath the ordinary tone, something had already shifted, and you were not looking for it because nothing about it looked dangerous. Most men are trained to watch for conflict alone, raised voices, slammed doors, tears. So when a woman is quietly finishing something in her mind, she rarely announces it. She just starts speaking a little differently. And that difference is easy to miss if you are only listening for a fight. That is why this matters. Somewhere in your recent conversations, there is a sentence, maybe more than one, that already told you where things stand. By the end of this video, you will be able to hear these sentences the way she actually means them, not the version most men imagine, not the panicked version, the real one. 5 of them, each a little quieter than the one before it, and the final one is the one almost no man ever catches until it is far too late. She didn't yell it. She didn't cry. She just said it. And that's exactly why you missed it. The phrase is simple. I need some space. 4 ordinary words, the kind that get said in 100 relationships every single day for 100 harmless reasons. A hard week at work, a fight with her sister, a headache that won't quit. Most of the time, it genuinely means nothing more than that. Context always matters here, and one tired evening does not undo a relationship. But there is a version of this sentence that carries a different weight entirely, and it has almost nothing to do with the words themselves. Psychologists sometimes describe this as flat affect, a noticeably reduced emotional expression in tone and face, even while the words stay calm and reasonable. In plain terms, it means her voice stops matching what should be an emotional moment. Listen for what's missing rather than what's there. If she asks for space with frustration in her voice, that's a woman still fighting for the relationship, still invested enough to feel something. But if the same words come out flat, almost administrative, as if she is requesting an extension on a deadline rather than protecting a connection she cares about, that stillness is the actual signal, not the space, the absence of urgency around it. You might be thinking, couldn't she just be exhausted or handling stress in her own quiet way? Sometimes, yes, and that possibility deserves real consideration before you assume the worst. But watch what happens the next time you try to close that distance. A woman who is simply tired will usually meet you halfway once she's rested. A woman who has already emotionally exited will maintain that same flat distance no matter how much effort you bring toward her. This is where most men make their first real mistake with this signal. They either panic and smother her with questions, which pushes her further into that flatness, or they ignore it completely and quietly hope it resolves on its own with time. Neither response actually addresses what's happening underneath the surface. And both, in their own way, only buy her more room to finish deciding. That flatness you just learned to recognize is only the beginning. Because there is a second sentence. One that isn't really a sentence at all, it's an absence. And that one is even easier to miss. At some point, she stopped asking. Not loudly. Not with an announcement. She just stopped. Think back to a conversation that once seemed ordinary. The kind where she used to ask how your day went, not out of habit, but because she genuinely wanted the details. The traffic, the annoying coworker, the small victory nobody else cared about. That question, asked consistently over time, is one of the quiet mechanisms researchers refer to as emotional labor. The ongoing effort someone invests in maintaining and monitoring the emotional well-being of a relationship. In plain terms, it's the work of staying curious about another person's inner life, and it takes real energy to keep doing. When that curiosity fades, it rarely disappears all at once. It gets replaced, piece by piece, with something far more efficient. Conversations shift from feelings to functions. Instead of, how did that meeting go? You start getting, did you pick up the dry cleaning? Instead of asking what's on your mind, she's confirming what's on the calendar. The relationship keeps running, but it starts running like a shared logistics system instead of a shared life. Of course, this does not mean every practical conversation is a red flag. Long relationships naturally settle into some amount of logistics. That's simply what stability looks like, and no couple spends every evening in deep emotional conversation. But watch the ratio, because that's really what this comes down to. One partner managing a schedule while still asking real questions, still wanting to know what happened underneath the surface of the day, is healthy. One partner managing a schedule while the real questions have quietly vanished entirely, replaced by nothing but coordination, is something else. And it tends to happen slowly enough that neither person marks the exact day it started. Remember what I told you at the start, that there was one sentence most men not only miss, but actively misread. We are getting closer to it now, and this disappearing curiosity is part of how you'll recognize it when it finally arrives. Here is the mistake most men make with this particular sign. They notice the logistics have increased, and they assume she's simply busy or stressed or handling more than usual. And sometimes that assumption is completely fair. But busy people, even exhausted ones, still ask questions when they care about the answers. What's missing here isn't time, it's interest. She stopped asking, and somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, you stopped noticing that she'd stopped asking at all. The third sign is quieter still, because this time, she's not talking about you at all. She's talking about a future that doesn't include you. Listen for the pronoun, not the plan, the pronoun. There is a specific kind of sentence that slips out during ordinary conversation, usually when she isn't thinking carefully about how it sounds. She mentions a trip she wants to take next year, a course she's been considering, where she pictures herself in 5 years, professionally or personally. And somewhere in that sentence, without any tension in her voice at all, she says, I, where you would expect to hear, we. This is what linguists and relationship researchers sometimes call future pronoun leakage, a term that sounds more technical than it needs to be. In plain language, it simply means the words we use to describe our future reveal, often without our awareness, who we actually expect to be standing in it. When two people are securely bonded, their language about the future tends to merge almost automatically. We should go there sometime. We could try that next spring. The pronoun isn't a decision, it's a reflex, built from months or years of imagining a shared life by default. When that reflex breaks down and we quietly turns back into I, it is rarely a conscious choice on her part. That's actually what makes it such a reliable signal. She is not strategically distancing herself in that moment. She's simply describing her future the way she has started to actually picture it without you in the frame, and the words are only reporting what her mind has already settled on. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this just how people talk sometimes, especially about personal goals like a career or a hobby that genuinely is just hers? And that's a fair point worth taking seriously. A woman describing her own individual ambition in I language is completely normal. That's healthy independence, not distance. The difference shows up specifically around future plans that used to be shared territory. A vacation you always talked about together, now described as something she might do alone. A future home, once discussed as our place, now mentioned as a place with no possessive attached to you at all. Remember what I told you at the start of this video? That there was one sentence most men not only miss, but actively misread when they hear it. This pronoun shift sits right at the center of that pattern, because it doesn't sound like rejection. It sounds like planning. One instance of this means very little on its own. People misspeak, and language isn't always precise. But a pattern of it, repeated across different conversations and different topics over the course of weeks, stops being an accident and starts being a fairly accurate map of where her mind has already gone. Most men catch the plan and completely miss the pronoun sitting quietly inside it. They hear about the trip, the course, the future job, and engage eagerly with the details, while the far more important structure underneath passes by completely unexamined. Of course, no one expects you to analyze every sentence like a transcript. That would be exhausting for both of you. But this one pattern, once you know to listen for it, becomes very hard to unhear. Now we get to something stranger, a sentence that isn't about the future or the past at all. It's a sentence, she says before, you've even asked a question. You didn't ask. That's what should have stopped you cold. There is a particular kind of sentence that arrives with no invitation at all. You haven't questioned where she was. You haven't brought up her phone, or her late reply, or the coworker she mentioned last week. And yet, out of nowhere, in the middle of an unrelated conversation, she says something like, nothing happened. Don't be weird about it. a full defense built and delivered for a case you never opened. Psychologists sometimes describe this as preemptive justification, a defensive explanation offered before any accusation has actually been made. In plain terms, it means someone is answering a question in their own head that you never asked out loud, because on some level, they already feel the weight of something that hasn't been named yet. The guilt, or the discomfort, or the awareness of a boundary being tested arrives before the suspicion does, not after it, which is the order most men expect. This is different from a partner who is simply transparent by nature. Some people naturally narrate their day in detail, where they went, who they saw, what happened, as a habit of openness, not defensiveness. The distinguishing detail is tone and timing. Transparent sharing feels light, almost incidental, offered the way you'd mention what you had for lunch. Preemptive justification feels weighted, arrives with unusual intensity for the size of the topic, and often includes a small edge of irritation directed at you, as though you had already accused her of something when you hadn't said a word. Of course, context always matters here, and this is worth sitting with for a moment before drawing any conclusions. A woman with a genuinely difficult past, a previous relationship that involved real jealousy or control, may have learned to over-explain simply as a trauma response, a protective habit built for safety in an old situation, rather than any evidence of guilt in this one. This does not automatically mean betrayal, and treating it that way would be both unfair and inaccurate. But watch what she's actually defending, because that's where the real information lives. If the explanations cluster consistently around one particular person, one particular set of evenings, or one particular pattern of behavior, that specificity tells you something a general habit of openness never would. General openness talks about everything equally. Guilt talks about one thing, repeatedly, with unusual care. You might be thinking, couldn't this just be anxiety or a personality that overthinks everything? And sometimes, genuinely, yes it is. But anxious over-explaining tends to spread evenly across many unrelated topics. Work, family, plans, everything gets narrated in detail. Guilt-driven preemptive justification, by contrast, stays remarkably concentrated. It shows up around the same handful of situations again and again, while everything else in her life goes completely unexplained. Here is the mistake most men make the first time they notice this pattern clearly. They either seize on it immediately, turning it into an accusation that confirms exactly what they suspected, which usually shuts the conversation down entirely and teaches her to stop explaining anything at all. Or they brush it off politely, telling themselves they're being paranoid or reading too much into an offhand comment, when the discomfort in their gut was actually picking up on something real, specific, and worth paying quiet attention to. Before we move to the final sentence, there is one more layer here that most explanations of this topic completely skip over. The unsolicited defense isn't really about deception at all. It's about internal conflict. She is negotiating with her own conscience out loud, in front of you, without realizing that's what she's doing. But even that sentence is still deniable. The fifth one isn't. Because the fifth one, she says almost by accident, and it's the one she'll deny ever saying at all. This is the sentence most men remember only afterward, replayed quietly, too late, at 2 in the morning, long after it could have changed anything. It rarely arrives during an argument. It doesn't come wrapped in tears or raised voices, the way you might expect an ending to sound. Instead, it slips out somewhere calm, during a quiet drive, in the middle of an unrelated conversation, sometimes even during a genuinely good moment. And it sounds something like, "You'll be fine," or "I already know how this ends," said almost gently, almost kindly, as if she's trying to soften something rather than announce it. What makes this sentence different from every signal before it is timing? Everything up to this point, the flatness, the missing questions, the shifted pronouns, the unsolicited defenses, describes a woman who is still somewhere in the process of deciding. This sentence describes a woman who has already finished deciding and is now, without fully realizing it herself, rehearsing the conversation she expects to eventually have with you. Psychologists refer to something adjacent to this as anticipatory grieving, the emotional process of mourning a loss before it has actually occurred. In plain language, it means she has already begun grieving the relationship internally, privately, well before any conversation about ending it takes place out loud. The sentence you hear is simply grief leaking out sideways, disguised as reassurance, because some part of her is trying to prepare you for something she hasn't consciously decided to say yet. This is why the sentence sounds so strange in the moment. It doesn't match the conversation around it. You'll be discussing something completely unrelated. A friend's situation, a movie, someone else's breakup. And she'll say, "You'll be fine," with a certainty that feels oddly specific, oddly personal, as though she isn't really talking about the other person at all. If you go back afterward and think carefully, you'll often realize she wasn't. Here is what makes this signal so easy to miss and so different from the other four. It doesn't feel like distance. It actually feels like care. Her voice is soft. Her intention seems kind. She appears to be comforting you or comforting herself. And so your instinct is to feel reassured rather than alarmed, which is exactly backwards and exactly why this sentence does more damage sitting quietly than any of the louder ones ever could. Of course, one such comment, said once, in an unrelated context, proves very little on its own. People say, "You'll be fine," about all kinds of situations that have nothing to do with the relationship at all. But when this phrase, or something close to it, begins appearing specifically around your future together, said with that same oddly settled certainty each time, it stops being a coincidence and starts being a preview. You might be thinking, if she's already decided, wouldn't she just say so directly rather than hinting at it sideways like this? And that's a completely fair question. But ending a relationship out loud requires a level of conflict most people instinctively avoid for as long as they possibly can, even after the emotional decision underneath has already been made. The rehearsed sentence is often the mind testing the words quietly, privately, before working up to saying them fully. Now that you can hear all five of them, the flatness, the silence, the pronoun, the unsolicited defense, and this quiet rehearsal, a pattern becomes visible that no single sentence could ever reveal on its own. None of these signals, taken by themselves, means the relationship is over, and it's worth resisting the urge to diagnose one bad week using everything you've just learned. But taken together, appearing consistently across weeks rather than a single difficult day, they describe something very specific and fairly rare. A woman who has already begun living, at least emotionally, on the other side of a decision she hasn't fully spoken out loud yet, even to herself. Now that you can hear it, all five of them, there's one more thing you need to understand about why she says any of this out loud at all. None of these 5 sentences works alone. Each one is quiet enough to dismiss on its own. A tired evening, a busy week, an offhand comment about someone else's life. But together, they trace a single underlying truth. A woman rarely leaves without warning you first. She simply doesn't warn you the way movies or arguments taught you to expect. She warns you in flat tones, in missing questions, in a shifted pronoun, in a defense you never asked for, and finally, in a sentence disguised as comfort. You now have something most men never get, a way of listening beneath the words instead of just to them. This does not mean you should start auditing every sentence she says, searching for hidden meaning in ordinary conversation. That kind of vigilance would exhaust you both and manufacture problems that were never real to begin with. What it does mean is that if this pattern ever does appear, quietly, consistently, across real weeks rather than one hard day, you will recognize it, calmly, clearly, and early enough to actually do something with what you know. I'd genuinely like to know which of these 5 sentences you've already heard and didn't realize it at the time. Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and this channel exists to keep naming exactly what most people only feel. There's a version of this that's even harder to catch than words. It's the silence she leaves instead. That's what we're breaking down next.